how do we calculate child support in Illinois?
In Illinois, we take
When does child support terminate? I feel like I always get this question.
So it generally ends when...
My name is Katie VanDeusen. I'm the managing partner at Sterling Hughes, and I am here with our senior partner, Ali Isroff, to talk today on our podcast. Thanks for coming, Ali.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Good. So, in terms of our topic today, we're going to be talking about support. So, clearly in Illinois, there's something called child support and something called maintenance or spousal support. So, Allie and I are going to be doing a deep dive into what the differences are between each of those types of support and maybe some key takeaways for each one. So, first, let's kind of hone in on child support, Allie. So, what type of formula currently exists, or how do we calculate child support in Illinois?
In Illinois, we take the incomes of both parties, and it's the incomes of both parties and the number of overnights that each party has. And there's a formula or a calculation that we do when we input those numbers that will give us the monthly child support amount.
Got it. And do you know what exactly is the name of that model, or is there a specific name of that model that's out there right now?
Yeah, it's the income shares model.
Okay. And so the concept is that whenever you have a minor child and both parties are paying support on behalf of that child, it's kind of pulling from both incomes, right? Not just one primary parent any longer.
Correct. I think it used to be that it was just the payor's income that was taken into consideration, and now both parties' incomes are taken into consideration. The courts recognize that both parents have a duty to support their kids.
Okay. And then what exactly, from your perspective, Allie, you've been doing this for a long time, what does child support actually cover on a monthly basis?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Clients always ask that because there's obviously so many things that you're paying for constantly as a parent for your children. But child support really just covers the basics. It's the food in their mouth, the clothes on their back, and the roof over their head. So it's just the very basics that covers. And then there's additional expenses, of course, for kids, related to, for example, out-of-pocket health insurance or their health insurance premiums, extracurricular expenses, school-related expenses, daycare expenses, and those are all separate and apart from the very basic child support payment or amount.
Okay, that's really interesting. So the monthly child support amount that one parent pays to the other is really just to cover basics, like necessities, really, is how I'm viewing it. And then these other things, you referenced health insurance, out-of-pocket healthcare, education, extracurriculars. How are those? How do you pay for those? How do you advise your client on how to pay for those moving forward? Is it a set amount? Is it a percentage? How do those work?
Yeah. So usually if the parties are making similar incomes, it's going to be a 50-50 split. But if the parties have very different incomes, it's going to be based on a percentage. So based on if a party earns quite a bit more, it may be more like a 60-40 split. Sometimes it's a 70-30. Generally speaking, it's more like a 60-40 if it's not a 50-50.
Okay. And the concept there, I'm thinking, is we try to set a child support based on an intact household. So if these two people had remained together and were financially supporting the child, that's how it kind of dictates how, monthly support should be. Is that right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Got it. Okay. And so then in terms of how you allocate those things, do you feel like the parties still have to kind of communicate and maintain some communication as to what the child is incurring, when the parent's incurring that on behalf of the child? And is there, always this exchange of money back and forth, or are there different options with that?
There are a few different options. It does require communication. I think this is an area where a lot of litigation actually ends up occurring because, one parent is like, well, I don't agree to that activity. And the other parent's like, well, they've always historically, for example, if a child has always played a sport that's maybe a little bit more expensive, like hockey, for example. I have kids that play hockey. Historically, our kids have always played that sport. It's an expensive sport. And suddenly you're getting a divorce. And now the person who is the payor is maybe not so excited about paying in addition to what they are paying in child support, paying for this hockey, even though, throughout the marriage and the child's life so far, this child has always participated in that. So it can become really frustrating for both parents. And I think, quite honestly, the child's the one that gets sort of stuck in the middle. But these are the issues that tend to get litigated most, where one party is sort of not inclined to want to pay that additional amount now that they're divorced and their monies are separate and they're not doing everything together. One
Yep.
party may say, I don't agree to that anymore. And then the other party's like, well, we've always allowed our child to do it. So, I'm going to file a motion and ask that the court, require that you pay that amount. And that's where a lot of litigation occurs, is in this sort of split of expenses. To your point about
Okay.
like how is money exchanged, it's usually we will include language in any sort of an agreement that when somebody incurs an expense, that they are then required to tender a receipt for that, and then the other party has a certain amount of time to pay that their portion back.
Got it. Okay. And then last question on child support. When does it end? When does child support terminate? I feel like I always get this question from the person who's paying, or
Yeah.
even sometimes the recipient, they want to budget and plan accordingly. So when does it end?
So it generally ends when they turn 18 or when they graduate high school, whichever is later.
Okay.
And then there's obviously some additional, well, there's not obviously, but there may be additional expenses owed once a child goes off to college for child, for tuition, for expenses while they're not in school and things like that. But that's kept separate from child support. That's sort of a separate area of college expenses.
Yep. And I feel like, I don't know about you, Allie, but I always get the question from clients, well, how do you actually calculate child support? Can't you just give me, take this percentage minus this? And I think there's a gap there where people don't always understand. It is based on like tables that the state releases through the legislature, and it's based on both incomes combined, the number of kids you have. So it's not just like hey, plug in these numbers to this formula and go. It's pulling from multiple different tables, multiple different sources, and it's a lot more complex than just A minus B equals C, right?
Correct. And I think that that's such a great thing to point out, because I think a lot of people come and they want us to run the support numbers, and I always tell them, like, listen, you can go and find a ballpark number on your own in any. There's many websites. Our firm offers a calculator on our website. And you can
Yep.
plug in your incomes. But the truth is, you need a professional or an expert like a lawyer to plug in all these other things. So, who's going to claim the children for tax dependencies? Are there other children from a different relationship? Are there
What was
mandatory retirement contributions that need to be included?
Yep.
There's so many different little nuances that a lawyer is going to be able to help you with, so that you can get to the exact right amount. Are you going to include insurance, health insurance, in that calculation or not? So there's so many little different nuances that you need to take into account. And I don't know that those nuances, the taxes definitely, the claiming of the dependency definitely can change the number quite a bit. Some of the other nuances don't change it that much, but it does help to have even a couple dollars sometimes helps people. So it's important to
Absolutely.
get that correct.
Definitely. I could not agree more. All right, shifting gears, let's now kind of shift over to maintenance or spousal support. Now, this used to be called alimony back in the day, but now it's maintenance or spousal support. So, what does that formula kind of look like, or how does that work?
For maintenance, you take the parties' incomes, and both parties' incomes and the length of their marriage. So in this case, we're looking at overnights, because we're not talking about child support. This is purely based on the incomes of both parties and the length of their marriage. If it's been a long-term marriage over 20 years, you're going to be looking at indefinite maintenance, which
Okay.
means that you'll get, the payor will pay for an indefinite period of time, and the payee will receive maintenance for an indefinite period of time. And then it goes down from there in terms of the length of maintenance. So it's not like if you were married 10 years, you're going to get 10 years of maintenance. There is a formula that is calculated that will determine how long you're going to get the maintenance for.
Okay, so there's almost what I'm hearing is there's two aspects to this kind of formula. One is duration, which I think you just touched on beautifully, which is it's really based on the length of marriage. And then there are different multipliers that are applied unless you've been married 20 or more years. And then there's almost like a second aspect, which is how much, the amount, which I think you said takes into account both parties' income levels. So is there any other details in terms of amount that you can share with, the people who are listening?
Sure. So the formula that we have only really works for incomes under $500,000 a year. Anything above that, it's sort of a different calculation. But for incomes under $500,000 a year, it's 33 and a third of the payor's net income minus 25% of the payee's net income. It cannot exceed 40% of the parties' combined net income. So I think that hopefully makes a little bit of sense. But the calculation, that's specific to numbers. The truth is that there are other arguments that can be made to a judge regarding the standard of living and like earning capacity, ability to earn. Does a person have some sort of injury or disability that inhibits their ability to earn? There's there's so many different nuanced issues here that
Yep.
maybe I'm getting off track a little bit, but those are the things that are taken into consideration when looking at the amount.
Got it. And then are there different types of maintenance or spousal support or alimony that can be paid? I know you referenced indefinite
Yes.
before. Are there different types?
Yeah. So, generally speaking, when you first get involved in a case, if the party's income or if the party's money is already kept separate, so you don't have a joint account, you're not sharing money, then one party is going to be looking for support. And so you can ask for temporary support, which is just sort of usually, it may not be as accurate as
Okay.
you would find out later on once you've completed discovery. But initially, once you fill out a financial affidavit and you exchange sort of the basic pay stubs, tax returns, and that kind of thing, you should be able to figure out a temporary support amount. And the courts will grant that in situations where one party doesn't have access to any funds or very little funds. And then later on, you can ask for a hearing and have a much more uh, accurate representation of your incomes based on much more discovery being exchanged, and that would result in a number of different types of maintenance. There's fixed term maintenance, there's reviewable maintenance, there's indefinite maintenance.
Got it. And I feel like we always get this question too. If I'm paying indefinite maintenance, does that mean I have to pay for the rest of my life until I die? And I think it's always important to preface indefinite from both sides. Someone receiving it, they may, mistakenly believe that they're going to receive it for the till the end of time. And from the person who's paying it, they feel like they're obligated to do that till the end of time. But why don't you talk about like reasonable retirement age and what that actually means? Can you come back in and change this or modify or seek to terminate at a later date?
Yes, absolutely. So I always tell people indefinite maintenance is never really indefinite maintenance. I mean, unless you're working until the day you die and you're making the same wages you were making, when you got divorced, which is generally not the case.
Mhm.
So the courts consider what's called a substantial change in circumstance a reason to modify maintenance or child support for that matter. So, for example, if you retire, that would be considered a substantial change in circumstance. Retirement age generally is 65. And so after you turn 65, if you're in that place in your life where you're looking to retire, you can always go in and seek to modify, file a petition to modify the maintenance award or the child support may be over by then. I guess it depends on if your kids have already emancipated. But maintenance, you would file the motion to modify based on the substantial change in circumstances and tell the court, listen, I'm not working, I'm not making what I was making anymore. I'm going to be living off of my, retirement accounts, and I'm not going to be able to support or pay this amount anymore. My income has vastly changed. And the courts will generally award a modification in that case. I think that in the case of maintenance, also a substantial change in circumstances is if you were let go by no fault of your own from your job. You can't
Yep.
like just quit your job and decide that you're not going to pay maintenance anymore. But if you were to be let go for a reason that was not, of your own fault, then that could be another reason to go in and ask for a modification or maybe even an abatement. Like, can you hold off on having me pay this until I can get on my feet again? There's lots of different options there.
And do you ever feel I had an experience once where I filed based on a reasonable retirement age of 65, and I actually got pushback on that. The judge actually told me, he's like, counsel, people are working until, 69. Sometimes Social Security doesn't always trigger until a little bit later. So I do think that that also causes a lot of, I think, debate over when is that kind of sweet spot in terms of a reasonable retirement age. And it's really subject to debate, I think, and litigation. You can always try to push back and say, is it really reasonable or is it not? So it's never as simple and straightforward as we wish it was, but that keeps us busy, right,
Yes,
Elise?
that's totally true. Another interesting thing is if you think about, a lot of people when they're working out their divorce agreements, they want to try to include everything they possibly can in the divorce agreement to avoid having to come back to court at a later date. And so one of the
Yeah.
things that we'll sometimes do is we'll do like a maintenance buyout, and we'll
Right.
say to the client, look, like, you're going to be the payee, you're going to be receiving the maintenance. Your husband is, call it, 60 years old. He's probably going to come back in about 5 years, maybe less, maybe more, depending on where he's at in his career. And he's
Yeah.
going to be asking to modify it at that time. And so maybe it's a situation where we can calculate out a reasonable amount for her to get paid, in that scenario, so that they don't have to come back to court and spend all this money litigating that retirement or that substantial change in circumstances. So that's something also that we talk with our clients about all the time, is that because you're hedging your bets. He could continue to work, but he could not, and then you could spend $20,000-$30,000 coming back to court to argue these things.
Absolutely. Or that aspect of the unknown that you bring up is so important because someone could get disabled,
Right.
someone could get terminally ill. You just never know what's going to happen. And I wish we all could have a crystal ball, but it just does not always work that way.
Yeah.
So, um, in the last couple minutes we've got, tell me about, how does maintenance terminate? Are there any factors to consider when it comes to ending maintenance or terminating maintenance?
Sure. So the most common are, like, if one of the parties passes away, then that is going to be a terminating factor. Or if one of the parties remarries, that's going to be a terminating factor. But more, I'd say, like, a lot of litigation, or more of I'd say the majority of litigation around termination and maintenance is when another party is living with another party,
Okay.
because there's a lot of case law on this issue. Judges, depending on where they live in the state of Illinois, or just what their beliefs are, will make their own determinations on this. It's very subjective, in my opinion. It's not cut and dry. So in the law says that you have to be living with somebody, or the other party, in order to terminate maintenance, has to be living with somebody on a continuing and conjugal basis, and there has to be some sort of like monetary, like, sharing of money. They have to be putting themselves out as if they were a married couple. So not just living together as like roommates, for example, but they have to be
Yep.
sharing expenses, going on trips together, buying groceries together, paying rent together, sharing their money, joint accounts. And in order to prove all that, sometimes you need to have a private investigator. I mean, it can be really, I mean, I've had people, have a private investigator stake out somebody's house and count how many nights the car is sitting in the driveway. Um,
Same.
yeah, I mean, we've subpoenaed bank records. There's a lot of this is, I'd say, where the biggest point of litigation is, because it's not remarriage. That's, you
Correct.
can get a marriage certificate. It's not death.
Yep.
There's this gray area. And so this tends to be where I think the biggest amount of litigation occurs with termination of maintenance.
So true. Allie, I cannot thank you enough for joining me today to talk through child support and maintenance, or spousal support, formerly known as alimony, and just helping everyone listening get a better understanding of what those things mean, how they're calculated in these cases. And we just always appreciate your time. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much. This is fun.
Child support and maintenance calculations seem straightforward until you realize most Illinois fathers are fighting for support they may not even be legally entitled to collect. If you're not the established legal father, none of these formulas matter. You have zero rights to seek support or custody. Here's the one step that protects everything in our next video.